everybody in the room here with us and welcome everybody online. I have the distinct honor to welcome you all and to introduce my dear colleague, Joanne Tombrakos. My name is Bahriye Goren. I'm a clinical associate professor in the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department. And I'm so happy to be here today. Just as a kind of a quick introduction to our department, we are basically the largest group, I would say, around that offers graduate degrees for marketing and communication students. We have over 1,000 students, and it's always a joy to be here and to teach our students. Why? Because they're so engaged. We have students from all over the world, and we have the best relationships, obviously, being in New York City with industry. And we're very proud to be a group of scholars, of industry practitioners, of students. And we do have a common goal and common vision where we all believe that marketing and communications can be a force for good in the world. And today I have the distinct honor to introduce my colleague, Joanne Tombrakos. Thank you. Joanne, faculty members, and could you maybe tell a little bit about yourself to the audience?
I have been teaching here now this is the beginning of my 11th year, which is a little frightening for you to imagine. And I teach marketing here. I teach digital marketing and social media, and I also teach in the real world program, which we'll get into. This is part of the reason this book exists. But prior to that, I was a practitioner full-time in the business, working for Time Warner and CBS on the advertising sales side of everything. So as I talked about in the book and I talk about in my classes, I think I have pitched just about, I don't even know, thousands of pitches to every industry under the sun. So
today we are all here for this book, Crafting Your Pitch, a Storytelling Framework. With that, Joanne, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what made you write this book?
Sure, no, absolutely. And the reason that the book started, it actually happened very organically. In 2018, I was asked to teach in the real world program. Dave Hollander, who runs that program. And the first client that we worked with at that time was JetBlue. And if anyone knows anything who's sitting in the room or online about the program, is that students have to apply to get in. The client actually gives the students a brief. They're divided into teams of 4, and the whole semester is about solving the problem. And then pitching that idea to the clients, the client gets to pick which one is the best one, not me. It was good, because I get very emotionally involved with the students over the course of time. But what I realized early on was that coming up with an idea was one thing, but how to present it was a whole different thing. And because of my own background, I knew how to do it. But it had been a long time before I actually sat down and said, you do this, this, and this. How do you tell a story convincingly? How do you pitch your ideas? So it started as the framework started as just a way for me to explain to my students how to do this. How am I going to break it down? I hate templates, I talk about that, but I do like frameworks. And I saw how it started to work. And I can still remember one day giving it to one of my students. And I said, I keep thinking I should maybe make it more creative. What do you think? She goes, absolutely. So it was kind of with that encouragement that it came to be. But because I teach that class, and now I've been teaching it every year, fine. So I saw what was working. I saw how I needed to explain it a little bit more clearly. In fact, in the fall, Jillian, who's sitting over here in the first row, got to read one of the drafts. And that a typo, by the way, right before it went to print. So that's kind of the story.
That's great. That's great. And I mean, it's already in the title, but you talk about story and the importance of stories when you are pitching. Why is that kind of the center? What happens if you don't tell a story?
If you don't tell a story, you're going to bore people to tears. That's really what it is. We're living, I go on about this constantly. We're living in a time where everyone is so distracted. So distracted. Having pitched in the real world myself, I know I was always dealing with a distracted audience. You don't know what someone is coming into the room with. You don't know if the dog ate their homework or their kids going to school. You always had to figure out how you're going to get someone's attention. Now it's 1,000 times worse because everyone's got those phones in front of them. So how do we engage people in a story that engages us? If we just throw up a bunch of data on a slide, no one's gonna pay attention to us.
And how do stories translate in other areas? That's basically how you start your book. You talk about your childhood, about
My
your
dad,
father.
consummate storytelling.
Exactly. And, but you also mentioned when we're in meetings, when we are trying to convince a colleague of something. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I talk about the idea of using story within to make a point, within a pitch. To make that point. So rather than just tell someone that they should do something, if you actually can figure out and you know of a story that's gonna help that person to understand it, they listen more. It goes back to just classical story, which is show me, don't tell me. So if I can show you and illustrate it through something that happens, and sometimes I have literally been on the way to a meeting and something has happened that opened the meeting because I figured out a way. It's like, oh my gosh, this makes total sense. And this is gonna pull people in so that they do pay attention to it.
One of the things that come to mind, especially with our audience here being students, when, for example, you're preparing for an interview, right? And we always think about what are our strengths, what are maybe some areas we want to further develop. If someone who is your potential employer asks you, hey, what are your strengths? What would be more powerful if you list a few characteristics or if you tell an anecdote, a story where your strengths get amplified, right? So there are so many instances where the power of storytelling is basically a way to connect this.
Exactly, rather than say that this is one of my attributes. You know, and even, again, most of everyone here as a student, is, well, I had this experience in one of my classes. And this was what I found out when I was in capstone or real world, whatever it might be. And this is what I discovered about myself. And that's a better way to say it than just say, well, I'm a leader.
Yeah.
That's nice. Convince me. Convince me.
I wanted to touch on one of the key things that you mentioned in your book, which is around the rule of three. And it sparked my interest because I love numbers. I'm a numbers geek in many ways, and I have this thing with number 5. So I thought it was fascinating to see that you have number 5 and number 3. Yeah, we have to talk about it. But maybe for those that haven't read your book yet, could you maybe talk a little bit about the rule of 3?
Well, it goes back to keeping it simple. So the industry standard has always been 20-minute presentation. You'll get almost anyone to listen to you for 20 minutes. If you really engage them, you'll get more than that. And the tendency is to inundate people with data and details. So to really focus on the rule of 3. These are the 3 big reasons why I have such a great idea. These are the 3 big reasons why I'm so good for your job. And focusing on that small number. And it started, it started for me when I started when I was selling country music in Philadelphia. And whenever we presented anything to a client, it was have 3 choices for them. So in those days, it was something that was on budget, something that was over budget, and it was kind of when something was really kind of extraordinary. But give people a choice because 3 is okay. 12 is too much.
And people start to
and we're so inundated with junk around us all the time that we want to keep it as simple as possible. So 3 is a good number. It turned out when I did some research that, it goes back to Aristotle, but I didn't really know that.
Yeah.
I must have been asleep in philosophy class, but.
With the logic, emotion,
logic
and
was there.
credibility. Actually, it's interesting, coming from a consulting background as well, we would say that too, when we present back to clients, we would want to summarize our findings in the top 3 clusters. So the rule of 3.
Like what you're no longer trying to convince someone of an idea, you're getting mired in the details.
Let me just pause here for just a brief moment. I have a bunch more questions, but I want to check in with the audience, see if anyone has any questions.
That story/pitch that you've ever heard that you didn't share in the book.
But I didn't share in the book. I don't know. I may have to get back to you on that because you're.
So you have pitch, you have storytelling. For me, a pitch is something, elevator pitch, something quick to the point. Storytelling and a beautiful story has richness, detail. So how do you bring them together?
Well, thank you. It's a good question.
Once in a
A
while.
little bit more than David. Yeah, to me, everything's a pitch. And everything is, right down to your plans for dinner that night with a friend, and you want Chinese and they want Italian, and you're trying to figure out how to get what you want. It's a pitch. essentially a pitch. But if you're too pushy about it, you're never gonna convince it. You have to figure out a way to tell a story around it. So that is how I see the same thing. To me, and I write about this in the book, I never really sold anyone anything in a pitch, but I told a really convincing story that led them to believe that whatever it was that I was pitching was a good idea, was whether it was me or whether it was something else.
I think at the heart of what you're saying, which really resonated with me also from your book, is that as a saleswoman, you said, I never sold anything.
Never sold anything, and I don't really believe that. I told a really good story though.
Yes, and so you're basically saying by telling a story, you engage people and they, become a partner, it's not about you selling something to someone, it's kind of having that.
It goes back to the show, don't tell. No one wants to be told to do anything. Okay, especially, we have data on that now from millennials and Gen Z. Quite frankly, I don't want to be told to do anything. But if you show me why I should do it, that's a whole different story. And that's where the storytelling comes in, because that is, there's a couple of story writers in here, so.
One of my students said they hated sales, and that was one of the reasons that pushed them towards marketing. And I pointed out that even though they may not be selling a product or a service, they're going to be selling their ideas constantly.
Thank you.
So the question I have for you is there any occasion in life where a pitch is not relevant?
I don't really think so. Because again, I think everything is, to some degree, everything is a little bit of a pitch. And I agree with you 100% because having been a salesperson, like a dirty word, everyone in business sells. And you're selling, if you're on a client facing, yes, you're selling to the client, but internally you're selling up to whoever you work for and you're selling down to the people who work for you. So there's constantly that sell in there, but it's in getting that idea out of your head. They get them selling, but it's not a bad thing. It doesn't have to be pushy. And I guess that's where the story comes in. Because if you're just trying to push something at someone, they're not gonna listen. You're gonna run the other direction. But if you engage, and we talk about that in marketing all the time. It's all about engagement. Marketing is selling. Marketing is how we sell.
It's the eternal battle between sales and marketing. And I think, Mark, you touched on an important aspect here that there is a negative connotation to selling because people think that you're trying to sell someone is you're trying to get money from someone or time commitment or something else. While indeed, when you approach it from the angle of, I'm not hard selling anything, we're having a conversation, I'm telling a story, it becomes a win-win versus someone gets something and someone else. We have another question from the corner.
One of the things we've been talking a lot about is different formats of writing, telling a story and everything from a press release to a blog to a tweet. And so can you talk to part of the format that you pick has to do with, because you're pitching in all of those something, right? You're trying to make a point about the importance of audience and understanding your audience when you're making a pitch.
Oh, yeah, I think knowing who your audience is critical. And it's not that hard to figure it out anymore because you've got Google, you've got, if you in business and you don't at least have a profile on LinkedIn, I don't know how you're surviving, quite frankly, but it's pretty easy to figure out who that person is and understand them. And, if you're out there and certainly when you're in a client-facing situation, which most marketers are going to be in, you get to know that person over time. So you know who it is that you're presenting to and get to learn something about them. You would ask a question first. So yes, I think knowing who that audience is and how they want to be spoken to is definitely critical. This as an example, so this semester, my two real world classes, one is EY and one is Porsche. Okay, it's going to be a little bit different how the EY students are going to talk to that client because they're consultants. It's a slightly different brain set than the one that they're going to be pitching to.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about the concept of the hook. And part of the basically the framework that you talk about in the book. And so could you tell me a little bit about the hook and why is it so important? It's one thing that I always mention. I don't call it the hook, but I call it like grab the attention from the get-go. I'm just very curious also for those that haven't read the book.
Well, the hook again is, you know, it's a storytelling thing. It's how am I gonna pull you in? You open up a book and it's like, what's the first page? Am I gonna keep reading it or not? You watch a movie, you turn something on Netflix, within the first couple of scenes, they've either pulled you in or you are like, I'm out of here. What else is on? I'm gonna keep on scrolling. And the same thing happens when you're standing in front of the room. You know, how am I gonna get someone's attention? You know, one of the things that drives me crazy is when people stand up and say, well, today I'm here to present to you X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, yeah, I know that. That's why I'm here. To do something to engage and to try, and again, this distraction thing where everyone, every single one of us is competing with technology. We're competing with these lovely little devices over here. So what am I gonna do so that you're gonna put it away and pay attention to me? Am I gonna make you raise your hand by asking a question? Is it and again, it should be something that has to do with what's gonna follow. It's not just, otherwise we call that clickbait, right? I'm just gonna hook you in, but what's following has nothing to do with it. It's up to you to continue to hold that attention. But what am I gonna do to make you stop? Because you, again, and you don't always know where someone's headset is when they walk into the room. You don't even always know who's gonna be in the room. You know, often you think you're gonna be presenting to 3 people and they decided to bring 2 others in. You don't even know why they're there.
You know, we'd love to hear some examples, but a hook can be really anything from a statistic to an image to something that just really grabs the attention. For example, in our department, one of our degrees is the executive master's, and we always start with a stat that says 60% of CMOs don't have anyone identified in their team that could succeed them. And right there, it makes the case for why there is a need for something, and it's intriguing because people become curious. Could you maybe with the clients that you're working with your real world students, maybe just give an example, whether it's Porsche or EY, what could be a hook to start a pitch presentation?
What could be a hook? You're stumping me again. It could be anything as asking someone a question that has something to do, to get everyone to physically raise their hand. That's an engagement, and now we're paying attention to you. How many people ever panic when they're using when they've lost their phone? This is a good one. Okay.
Yeah, that is a good
Okay.
one.
I used to worry about losing my wallet. Now I worry about business. How many people have ever had that happen? And that's it's a silly question, but it may make sense for whatever it is that you're gonna pitch. So you make yourself more human and more real. And again, another thing that I talk about all the time, and I'm sure I'm not alone on this, is for all of you who are students in this room, you know, how are you gonna differentiate yourself from AI? If AI can do the pitch, can do the presentation, we don't really need you. So looking for those human connections, because I still believe at the end of the day, this is what we want. Not, you know, my new thing now is the Vision Pros. I don't really want to walk down the street with one of those things.
I wanted to ask you about something that was a bit surprising for me, because one of the things that when I think about stories and when I think about preparing for my classes or client presentations, when I think about the stories that I'm going to tell, I always try to think about how do I make this human and really get this connection. And so for me, the characters that are part of the stories, whether it's an anecdote that I'm telling or something about myself, but that aspect of the characters, I was very curious how that fits into your framework and what your advice is there. And how does that fit in with a business presentation? Because I really do believe it does, but it's not as intuitive, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back into, you know, when it's the unraveling of the story where you can actually create a character within that. So if you're pitching an idea, who is that person that you're targeting? Okay, so you, instead of just saying, well, here's all the things we're gonna do, and you have a list of bullets. Well, you know, Martin's the target character. So this is Martin, and he's an assistant dean at NYU, and this is what he's on, he's this thing on Instagram, whatever the brand is. And then he sees it and he's excited. So you can kind of take him through, and now you're making it more human and you put character into it.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. How do you know that you're successful in your pitch and your story? How do you measure success?
You personally?
Yes, I mean personally, but also as someone who is say, for example, presenting to a client?
Well, if you're presenting to the client, you're gonna have some sort of KPIs at this point, right? This is how we're gonna measure success, when we go back to the rule of three, is that.
No, I mean, I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, how do you measure the success of your pitch?
Oh, well, if you get in business, you convince someone, that's definitely success. But, you know, for me personally, and I tell everyone this, is that all you can do is your absolute best. So are you proud of it? Did you come up with a good idea? Not every pitch that you're gonna make out there is gonna, just like not every job that you're gonna pitch, you're gonna get it. But have you done your absolute best? Have you been your best? And to me, that's the measure of success. That is like, I'm proud of this. You know, I was finished the book and I was proud of it. I started reading it again the other night and I'm still proud of it, so that's okay. So sometimes you go back and say, okay, what did I do?
Oh, and again, I think like landing the business is one, but another measurement of success could be that you started building a relationship. So if you're noticing that through your stories, you connect with your audience, and even if say you don't, land the business on the spot, it could be the beginning of a beautiful relationship that, gives fruits later on. So, success, I think, of storytelling is also evident in the interactions, right, that you have in the world, not as maybe a tangible.
And maybe you don't get, maybe there's no close, so to speak, in that particular situation, but now you have developed relationships.
Exactly.
Because these relationships are everything. I talk about this, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is that your networking, it becomes, I do believe it's your network. It's how you build those connections down the road. And maybe something isn't happening in the moment, but it's going to happen down the road. You tend to cultivate that. That's why we always just say thank you.
As someone who has a special affinity with improv, I was very happy to read that chapter where you were talking about the yes and principle. And again, for those that haven't read the book yet, could you maybe talk about that and what does that mean?
Sure. A friend of mine has and I talk about her in the book, Rebecca Stewart. She is an actor and she has a company downtown called Improvolution. And they do improv. And what they're doing now is they're using improv in business situations a lot. They do a lot of training in-house because it teaches you how to think on your feet. And she convinced me to take one of her classes and I went and I learned stuff about myself that day. But the thing that I took away the most was this yes and, which is a storytelling technique that they use in improv. So it's as opposed, our tendency is to always say yes, but just talked about this morning. Wow, and give 1,000 reasons why something's not going to work. Right? We do that to ourselves, we do that to other people. But if we go into the yes and, we've now continued the story. We haven't stopped ourselves. Maybe that's not the end of it. Yes, and continue to go on with that. And to think in that, especially when you're going through this whole process of how you're going to build this thing out. I mean, yes, as opposed to, but even when you don't like it. Yes, that's a nice idea. And let's do this, even though we can't do it. So,
Yes, absolutely. We check in with the audience in Patrick, just so we include our folks online. There may be a question.
He said, how do I grab my audience's attention in seconds with my pitch? Where should I start? With a solid number or anecdote if I'm speaking with a group of investors?
well, I think that I hate to say this, but it depends. It depends on what the investors are and it depends what the pitch is. In that case, yes, a number could be great for anything. And again, as you said earlier, a big number. Big on the screen and a really nice slide that goes along with it, so no one has to read. That's a whole other part of it. So I think it would really depend on who exactly the investor is. If we know what they're like, or are they relaxed, are they not? What's going to impress them the most? Or is that anecdote have something to do with what the potential investment is going to be that's going to grab them in?
So Diane asks, any tips on how to gracefully manage conversations when clients are disinterested or disagree with the presented narrative?
That's where improv comes into play. Wouldn't you say that? That's the thinking on your feet. And I don't think there's one answer, but listening and listening not just to what they're saying, but also with their body language has a lot of bearing there. And you really have to figure it out as you go along. There's not a You know, again, I hate templates. There are no right or wrong, well, there's a couple of right or wrong answers, I would say, but there's no right or wrong answer on that, but that would really be I gotta think on my feet and see what happens here.
When you
And
say,
trying to figure out how you're going to you might even pull in other stories that you have in the back of your head. You know, when things, especially if there's a lot of money sitting on the table, you really have to be prepared. You know, or you may be working for a company and you're constantly doing the same pitch. You may be doing different presentations, but you have to be really prepared so that if those questions come up, you've done a little bit of troubleshooting, so you're a little bit more prepared. Like the what ifs, you know, if when I teach real world, and Jill's laughing at me over here, but it's I'm constantly in the tough love situation, so that you got that situation before you can go in there. So hopefully you're gonna come up with what the answers are. But again, I think it's a lot of agility, it's thinking on your feet in that case, and being well prepared, knowing more than you need to know.
yeah, and I also think with when people get disengaged, it's okay to ask for a pause, to actually pause. Say, let's take a 2-minute break. And then connect with that person one-on-one, or over the coffee machine, or if, you know, if the situation, as you said, it's thinking on your feet and having a few scenarios prepared.
Yes,
is the most
yes.
important. We have a question.
So like, I know you do podcasts, you also teach, like you also present to like audiences. And how does that experience differs from, say, writing a book? Because like writing, I feel like it's the hardest to attract attention from the audience, and how your narrative kind of differs from really communicating with each other, like verbally.
I am at the point where, you know, what you see is what you get. I write the way I speak. In fact, I think it was John O'Malley who may be listening, and I don't know. But when we read the book, he said to me that I love this because it's no jargon. And that's kind of where I am. I also think it's important to speak and write in a conversational tone for a lot of reasons. A, it engages us more. Those of you who are in the marketing situation in here know we're talking about SEO. SEO has become much more conversational. That's what Google is looking for all the time. So we don't want to be spoken to in a way that's boring us. So it's kind of that human thing. So I really write for myself. I write the way I speak. Writing is in front of you, it really forces you to sit down. In fact, it took me much longer to write this than it should have. But you know, I walked to the table.
But it's a very important point to bring up, because being a loyal listener of your podcast, I felt you had the exact same tone of voice in your book.
Yeah.
So you write very authentically. That's the difference you are, and I think that's also very important when telling the story, that it comes from an authentic place. Again, versus trying to like sell something. No, you're actually sharing something.
And then again, my career started in radio when like that was really a big thing in the world. And we were all like that because we were constantly in competition. You had 22 stations, radio stations in the market that you were all competing for the same different clients. What kind of ideas were you going to come up with? So it was always fun in that degree. So it makes it a little easier.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question, especially given that a lot of our students are international students, and being a non-native English speaker myself as well, I was very curious if you had any tips or suggestions for non-native speakers when they have to tell a story in a language that's not their native tongue.
I was talking about this just this morning, is that the first thing you need to do is to slow down. I am a native New Yorker, left to my own devices, and second generation Greek, which doesn't help anything. I took a mile a minute. And when I started to have a client-facing job, I had to slow it down. But when I started to teach here, I had to really slow it down. It's made me a better speaker. There's no two ways about it, because I said, oh, everyone's listening with a different ear. You know, some people, yes, English might have been the first language, some not. Some learn 2 languages at the same time. And that idea that it's pausing is okay. You know, we do not have to feel like we're running a race to get all of our words out at once. Sometimes pausing can be more effective than actually saying anything. So really just thinking about slowing it down. I had this conversation this morning with one of my students who's been in 10 years a mile, and so we're going to do this all semester. we'll get you to slow down. Because we're all listening to the different ears. That's what I would suggest, is just try not to force it all out in a hurry, just people will listen to you. So it's okay to have white space.
One more question. I think for, when you brought up international students, it made me think of this more, but I think one of the hardest thing for our students to pitch, you know this, is ourselves. And so can you help students in how, what in your book are some of the things that can help students become more comfortable or practice pitching themselves? Once they get it, they really get it, but it's some, you know, a lot, it's not, they're not to be boastful or to not to oversell, and also to incorporate storytelling, telling their stories, because their stories are so rich, and even why they're here, what they're studying and why they're studying it, and how can that become part of their pitch of themselves?
Well, first of all, I think it's always hard to pitch yourself. I have a book. I'm a marketer. I know how to sell anything. This is hard. It's hard because it's me. So it's definitely always gonna be harder. But I think there's a mind game you have to play in there too. You have to constantly remind yourself of who you are and what you're doing. And I kid you, this is a true story. We all have our moments, and I know other people in the room who are more in my age bracket over here, is where we have imposter syndrome. It's like, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? I literally will reread my biography. I had those moments. Oh, that's right, I have done something. But you know, you have to do that, and you have to kind of psych yourself. There's no other way to describe it before you go in to present yourself. You know, what is really talk to, maybe you have someone in your life who's your cheerleader that's gonna cheer you on, so that you can really pull through those points and think about it. Think about, you know, where, again, kind of going back to what we said earlier, is where are your strengths and are there stories that you'll be able to pull in about that? But it really is a mind game. I got nervous before today. As soon as I walked in, I saw Mark, and then I see the deed. I'm like, really? All of a sudden, I'm nervous.
My question is about audience management. Mostly, I had heard a long time ago that the best way to manage an audience was to find one person and to consistently look at it throughout the entire presentation. Do you have any recommendations as to what you should do to manage the audience?
Oh yeah, I'm a big believer that you need, especially if you're in front of a really big room, find at least one person you can make eye contact with that you know is paying attention to you.
And has a friendly face.
A friendly face. So I think that's really what it is, and trying to, again, listen not just to what people say, but where their body language is going. You know, not just as the instructor here, I have to like, who am I losing here today? What's going on? It's a time for me to take a break. You know, I've got this front row over here, but what about those people over there? So that you're not just, you're kind of multitasking in your head all the time. You know, empathy is important, and being empathetic has a lot of different aspects to it. But yeah, well, you know, this is okay, but I think I lost Kadisha.
Yeah, I have a question. Is it absolutely necessary to create a new story every time? Like, I understand that like different briefs would like be very, very different, but some would be similar. And in those thousands of pitches that you've done, are they absolutely unique?
No, absolutely not. First of all, I think as you go along, is that watch what other people do. And you can do it right when you're sitting in a classroom for that matter, because you've got, in this program, you've got practitioners, you've got people who have been out there in the real world. You know, what do you like? What don't you like? Well, maybe I'm gonna figure out a way to incorporate that into what I do. So does that answer you? I know there was another part of it and I forgot it already.
Yeah, just is it okay to reuse your stories? Is it okay to reuse your stories?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've got it. Maria here is spent 2 days a week with me, she's got it. And I'm like, sometimes I'm looking at it thinking, I know I told this story, but I don't think I told it in this class. So it just happens. It just happens and it's okay. Because they may not remember anyway. It depends on who you're pitching on. You know, you're always improving upon it, right?
Yes.
Making a little bit better, embellishing a little bit.
You have another question.
What is your go-to story that you find yourself telling the most often that plays into your strengths? Like, is there a story that you feel like that is your go-to when you're creating a pitch or that you use the most often?
I don't think so. I can't really think of that. But to go back to a little bit more about story and what you were saying earlier about boasting, which it's okay to brag about your achievements, but figuring out a way to do it into a story like that. So I don't think I have one in particular. I really don't. But I'm kind of, like my father, I've got a host of.
Also, sometimes when you pitch an idea, sometimes the idea doesn't originally come from you. And sometimes there are ideas that don't really resonate with you. So how would you create a story through that? Like what inspires you to, be able to get this idea that you originally didn't like and turn it into a story?
Yeah, and that's a great question because that's what you can find out a lot in your careers.
Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna be asked to present something, come up with an idea for something, and it's like, really? I don't even like this. Okay, and I talk about that, I think I write about it in the book, now I've kind of forgotten. But when I started my career, I was in Philadelphia and I was selling country music radio. And I hated country music. I was at the station, they hired me at the station, my first job, they switched to format, and 4 months into it. And the next thing you know, I'm selling country. This was a long time ago, there was nothing cool about country in the 80s, trust me. And I was in Philadelphia, so everyone thought the station was gonna fail. It didn't, it's still around. I know Mark, you live in Philadelphia, the station's still there, WSDU. So you have to make a game out of it and you have to find what the value is. What I learned was that there was value to that product. That there were people who loved that format and they would buy anything anyone was advertising from, which was great for the brands. I made a boatload of money at that station. So I really learned to like it and then improve my story down the road. But make a game of it. I'm a big believer that you have to figure out ways to have fun. Even when you don't like what's going on. Like, how can we make a game out of this? I'm gonna figure this out. I don't really like this, but I'm gonna figure out what the aspects are. And again, going back to empathy is putting yourself into the shoes of the other person who is the target.
And that's actually, it's such an important question you asked because I started my career at Unilever, and actually one of the first sessions we had with kind of the senior leadership when we started was they said, it's actually better if you are not a user of your own product, you're not the target audience. Because then you don't bring in your own opinions and viewpoints, but you really have to put yourselves in the shoes of the customer. And indeed, really help them, really listen to them, really need to have empathy with them. And oftentimes your story and the value proposition that you identify becomes stronger because it's not painted with your own glasses, but it's really kind of from an objective standpoint.
Good point.
So, excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you like it too much, you may be too close to it.
Yes.
Do you believe that great storytellers are born with the skills? And if so, like, for example, it takes some time for me to be good in public speaking or telling a story. If so, how can we compete with that?
Oh, you can learn.
You can learn.
You can learn. Do you read? Do you watch movies?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, that's a great way to learn.
Right.
Okay, you learn what you like and what you don't like it. And watch and observe. There's something as simple, TED Talks are great ways to see how people figure out ways to tell stories, and they're so short, and you can learn from them. 20 minutes. They go back, some of them are 18 minutes or even less than that. I believe anything can be learned. I except singing, although I'm told I can't sing. I'm not someone who taught singing lessons and said she could teach me, but I could go down that. I just like to listen to music. So yeah, you definitely, absolutely.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I definitely have someone. I wanted to ask you about the big idea. You talked about big idea. The room is filled with marketing and communication students. I think all of us are familiar with the term of a big idea. But I found it very fascinating in your book that you really made kind of a rule that said it has to be in one sentence. And so could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Nobody likes when they're in classes, but they get used to it. Because if you can't, in today's world, if you cannot state what your idea is in one sentence, no one's gonna get it. They are gonna keep on scrolling. And I'm using that metaphorically right now, but that is really what's gonna happen. And if you can't state it in one sentence to your audience, how do you think the customer's ever gonna figure out what it is? So that's hard, but it's not impossible. That's what the challenge is. And then it also helps you as you're pitching because now you know what that is. It's always in your head. One thing. sense.
What would you recommend, our students here or people online about, how can they learn this technique that you describe in your book about the story unfolding? How do you it kind of ties back to Kathy's question earlier, kind of like, the structure to writing or to telling. Because I do think that's a skill, and a skill that can be learned, but it's not always intuitive because we often immediately jump to the outcome or we get stuck with the problem statement. But this whole, this part of the story unfolding, any recommendations there, or how have you learned that?
The story unfolding?
Yeah.
Well, it goes back, it's that, I use the classic story arc in the book, from the hook to setting the stage, which is, in this case, in a marketing case or business case, is, leading up to all the research, with the research you've done that's gonna help to support this idea. And that big idea is your, inciting event when it comes to storytelling. And then there's the unfolding of the story, which in this case is how this thing's gonna work. And then there's something, so a story always has some sort of resolution at the end. And for that, I do the analogy of, okay, now we're gonna tell them what we told them because they might have missed it. We have to remind them of why this is such a good idea.
What do you advise anyone, and I think we've all been there, you stand up, you tell, a story, you start presenting, and you realize you either forgot something key or you made a mistake. You may have unintentionally said something that someone may not like in the audience, and you're aware of it. And you catch yourself making a mistake. Like you're still standing there. What do you do?
Oh, I think you laugh at yourself. That's what I do. I mean, sometimes you just have to admit it. I think trying to pretend otherwise isn't gonna get you anyplace. It's like, oh, I forgot this. And it does make you a little bit more human, but I do think often when we're presenting, we think we're not human.
Yeah.
But that's what we're there for, is to connect with other human beings. Because when you're in business, you're trying to develop relationships.
And it actually makes you more, I think, also just
Real.
And I actually saw a post on LinkedIn just a couple of days ago with a public speaker who said they actually purposefully planned a little error earlier on in their presentation. They fumble on. I don't know if I fully buy into this because I think being authentic versus staged is always better, but they were saying that they purposefully do it so that the audience does kind of become more disarmed and they see them as a human being who's not perfect and also maybe.
Yeah, I don't remember the stage part either, but if you can figure out ways to get people to laugh anymore,
Exactly.
the world is a little nuts. I don't know if anyone has noticed that. And I've actually been reading a lot where they're actually saying that humor is back in fashion in marketing. That they're going to start to see more humor and even in the advertisements that we see. But if you can figure out a way to get people to laugh, to giggle even for a couple of minutes, everyone's starving for that right now.
Yeah.
And if you can incorporate that in, people will start listening to you a little bit more, because we need a little bit of a break from the nuts.
Yeah.
And that's the world that we're living in.
And I feel like we're often harder on ourselves than others. So if you're up there and there's a mistake, nobody's going to be bothered by it.
Look, and learning to laugh at yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm pretty good at it, because I do silly things all the time. My mother was terrible at laughing at herself, my father, the opposite, so I saw both ends of it. But I think learning to laugh at ourselves, it's not the end of the world when you figure this out. And it's okay if you trip in front of the room with a slide. Look, and things are gonna happen. Technology is not perfect. Slides are not always gonna work. I don't care where you are. I've seen it happen 1,000 different times. So learning to laugh a little bit, I think it helps you and it'll help the audience.
So if, I always say to my students too, and actually to myself when I go to a class, what is the one thing I want people to take away? If there was only one thing that I want them to remember. And from your book, if someone reads it, thinks of it 6 months from now or 6 years from now, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
One thing. It's also important now. I think the one thing would be, and which is actually how I end the book, which is whatever you're doing is to go with it and be your absolute best. And let the rest of it go, and you have to learn to let it go because not everything is in your control. This is spoken from a true control freak. Okay, I'd love to control things, but I've learned you have to let things go. To do something that you're really proud of, you know, sometimes you're gonna win, sometimes you're not gonna win. You'll always get better at it, and just that's really it. Just, you know, be your best, which were my mother's words. She never said to us, be the best. She might have said it, but what I remember is be the best, like be your best. Always be your best. And that's all you can do. That's all you can do. So that you're proud of, it's like, okay, I did a good job. I may not have won, but I did a good job.
Thank you so much, Joanne.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Very appreciative of your time. Again, everyone, crafting your pitch, storytelling framework. And thank you so much.